I found trust transfer documents in my son's desk at 2 in the morning. One signature line waiting for mine, still blank. A yellow sticky note on the front page read, "Before baptism." His wife slept down the hall. The nanny was behind a locked nursery door with my 7-month-old grandson. I photographed every page, slid the drawer shut, and returned to my study in silence. He had no idea what he just handed me. Let me go back to the night my son moved home, and everything started to unravel. This story starts quietly, but I promise you it won't stay that way. One small thing before we start. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had someone in your family use love as leverage against you? Just yes or no. I read every single one. Some details have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. The lesson at the heart of it is what truly matters. You will never hold that baby again until you sign. Old man. Tamara Ashford, 35. Said it the way someone reads a verdict. Not a request, not even a threat. Really. A statement of fact delivered with the kind of composure that made you think nothing could rattle her. Until you noticed how tightly she gripped her own wrists when her husband was in the room. She stepped between me and the bassinet where my grandson had been sleeping for the past 20 minutes. And she planted herself there like a wall built out of silence and entitlement. 25 family friends stood frozen in my living room during a dinner Tamara had insisted on hosting that first month. Champagne going flat. The last of the plates still on the sideboard. And now the woman my son married was telling me, in front of every person I had invited into my home, that I would not touch my own grandchild unless I handed over what she wanted. I am Eugene Ashford. I am 70 years old. I spent 44 years building a private bank from a single desk in a rented office in Montpelier into an institution that managed wealth most people cannot imagine. I have sat across from men who tried to bluff me out of 8-figure deals. I have buried my wife. I have watched my fortune grow past numbers I stopped counting aloud because the sound of them made my children act differently around me. And in all of that time, across all of those rooms and negotiations and losses, no one has ever used a baby as a bargaining chip against me until that afternoon. Let me ask you something. If someone used the person you love most in this world as collateral, would you scream? Would you flip the table and let every guest see the rage you are entitled to? Or would you start counting? Because I started counting. I counted the seconds my son, Garrett Ashford, 38, stared at his plate without lifting his eyes. Garrett once ran a private equity fund out of Boston with the kind of confidence that made investors forget to read the fine print. That confidence was gone now. What sat at my dining table was a man who could not look at his own father, while his wife delivered an ultimatum he had clearly rehearsed with her. 7 seconds. That is how long Garrett studied the grain of my mahogany table, while his wife held my grandson hostage in plain sight. A woman near the window, a colleague of Tamara's whose name I never learned, broke the silence. "Garrett, are you going to say something to your father?" He said nothing. So I did. "I understand," I said. I placed my napkin beside my plate. I folded it once, the way Lorraine taught me, corners aligned, no wrinkles. "Excuse me." I stood. 25 faces turned toward me, some with pity, some with the raw discomfort of people who realize they have witnessed something they were never meant to see. I did not look at any of them. I did not look at Tamara. I did not look at my son. I walked through the hallway of the house I built 30 years ago. The house where I carried Lorraine over the threshold and where I held her hand the night she stopped breathing. My footsteps were the only sound. The hardwood creaked the way it always does near the second door frame. The spot Lorraine used to say was the house talking in its sleep. I passed her photograph on the mantel. She had that half-smile she always wore when she knew I was about to do something she would either be proud of or furious about. I did not stop. I could not afford to stop. Because stopping meant feeling. And feeling meant losing the count I had been running in my head since Tamara opened her mouth. The library door closed behind me with the soft click of a lock engaging. My desk sat where it has always sat, facing the window that overlooks the garden where Lorraine planted roses the year Garrett was born. I walked past the bookshelves, past the framed charter of the bank, past 44 years of evidence that I am not a man who panics. I knelt beside the desk and reached for the bottom drawer. The one with the lock only 2 people in this world ever knew the combination to. One of them was buried in the cemetery on Elm Hill Road. I turned the dial. What I carried out of that library 15 minutes later would dismantle my son's freedom, expose accounts he never knew I could see, and guarantee that not one person standing in that reception hall would ever mistake my patience for permission again. But to understand what was in that drawer, you need to understand what I spent 44 years building and who I lost along the way. To understand what was in that drawer, you need to understand who put it there and why. 44 years ago, I walked into a condemned brick building on Maple Street in Millbrook, Vermont, with $1,100 and a woman who had no business believing in me but did anyway. The building smelled like wet plaster and mouse droppings. The windows were boarded. The front door stuck on a warped frame that I had to shoulder open, while Lorraine stood on the sidewalk holding a box of file folders and a coffee thermos, watching me wrestle with the door the way she would watch me wrestle with every impossible thing for the next 4 decades. That was Ashford Private Trust on its first day. 1 desk, 1 rotary phone, 1 chair I borrowed from the Methodist church basement, and my wife standing behind me saying, "If the ceiling falls in, I'm not filling out the insurance paperwork." She was 30 then. Brown hair she never dyed, hands that could arrange a bouquet and balance a general ledger on the same afternoon. Lorraine Ashford had the quietest instincts of anyone I have ever known. She would sit beside me during client meetings, never speaking, just watching. And afterward, she would lean over and whisper things like, "That man's lying about something. Check the second page again." She was right so often it stopped surprising me and started scaring me. I built the bank the way you build anything worth keeping. Slowly, 1 handshake at a time. 1 loan reviewed until the margins made sense and the character of the borrower made more. I learned to read numbers and people with equal precision. And over 44 years, that condemned storefront became the most trusted financial institution in our corner of Vermont. I could smell a bad loan the way other men smell a storm coming. Lorraine taught me that. She taught me most of the things that mattered. You spend 44 years learning to read every number on a page, training yourself to catch the decimal that does not belong, the payment that arrives 2 days too late, the signature that presses too hard into the paper. And then the number that should have alarmed you most turns out to be the one sleeping 2 doors down the hall from you. But I am getting ahead of myself. 6 years ago, I sold my majority stake in the bank, kept 12% equity and a seat on the advisory board that nobody expected me to actually use. The proceeds joined decades of quiet accumulation investments Lorraine and I managed ourselves. Properties held under trust structures I designed personally. Accounts spread across institutions where discretion was not a courtesy, but a condition. $45 million. That is what we built. And not one person outside of Lorraine and our estate attorney ever knew the full number. That was by design. The day our net worth crossed 7 figures, Lorraine and I sat at the kitchen table and made one rule. Wealth you show is wealth someone will come for. So I drove the same truck, wore the same boots until the soles told me they were done, drank the same $2 coffee at Harmon's Diner every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Our children grew up comfortable, educated, never hungry, never wanting. But they never saw the architecture underneath. They never knew what the house was really sitting on. Lorraine died 4 years ago. Cardiac arrest on a Sunday morning in September. Standing at the kitchen counter, arranging lilacs she had cut from the garden 10 minutes earlier. I found her on the floor, with one stem still in her hand and the vase half full. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. It did not matter. She was already somewhere I could not follow. The estate went silent after that. 6 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, 14 acres I cleared myself when I was young enough to think that was a reasonable weekend project. The house held its breath the day she left and never exhaled. I still set 2 coffee cups on the counter every Sunday morning. I pour one, drink it, and wash them both. I do not know when I will stop. I do not want to find out. So there I was, 70 years old, a widower in a house that felt like a museum of someone else's life. A fortune no one could see. A career that taught me to spot the difference between a business struggling honestly and one being bled dry from the inside. I had simply never expected to need that instinct inside my own home. Because the most dangerous number I ever failed to audit was not on any ledger. It was carrying my last name. And 16 months before that baptism, it called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "Dad, I need to come home." The call came on a Tuesday evening in July 2024. Garrett's voice was flat and rehearsed, the way a man sounds when he has practiced bad news in the mirror before dialing. It was the market. Dad, nobody saw it coming. The fund's done. I listened to my son explain how his private equity operation in Boston had collapsed under conditions beyond his control. He used words like exposure and liquidity crunch and systematic correction. And every single one of them landed with the polished weight of a sentence that had been rehearsed until the seams disappeared. I have spent 44 years listening to men explain why their numbers went wrong. The ones telling the truth stumble. They repeat themselves. They get angry at their own story. Garrett did none of those things. His explanation was smooth and complete, like a door that had been painted shut. But he was my son. And a father wants to believe the boy he raised still has some honest lumber holding him up, even when the foundation is already starting to crack. "Stay as long as you need," I told him. "That's what this house is for." They arrived within a week. 4 suitcases, a rental car, and a way Tamara had of walking through a doorway as though she were assessing the property value of every room she entered. I gave them the east wing, the rooms with the best morning light, the rooms Lorraine always loved, the ones she said made her feel like the house was breathing in. I did not ask follow-up questions about the fund. I did not press for documents or timelines. I simply watched. The way I had watched clients across my desk for 4 decades. And I filed what I saw in the same mental ledger where I kept every number that did not quite add up. Months passed. And then the baby came. Oliver James Ashford arrived in April 2025, 7 pounds, with his grandmother's wide brown eyes and no idea that every adult in his life was already drawing lines around what he was worth. I held him in the nursery the first night Tamara let me. And something inside the house shifted. A window opened that had been sealed since Lorraine died. Air moved through rooms that had been holding their breath for years. I spent hours in that nursery, rocking him, whispering to him about the grandmother he would never meet. "Your grandmother would have held you all day and dared anyone to take you from her," I told him. And I meant every word. Oliver did not understand me, but he curled his fingers around my thumb and held on with the blind confidence of someone who has not yet learned that people let go. For the first time since I washed those 2 coffee cups alone, I believe the house might hold something besides memory. Have you ever watched a stranger walk into your own home and start drawing lines around the people you love? In the pit of your stomach, that those lines were not drawn for protection. In August 2025, 3 months before the baptism, a nanny appeared. Roxanne Platt, 29, hired by Tamara without a word to me. She arrived with a warm smile, a spotless resume printed on heavy cardstock, and the quiet confidence of someone who has been briefed on exactly which doors in the house she was meant to close. On her second day, she stopped me in the hallway outside the nursery. "The pediatrician recommends structured bonding windows, Mr. Ashford," she said. Clipboard angled toward me like a shield. 30 minutes daily is optimal for the baby's attachment development. 30 minutes. in my own house, with my own grandson. I looked at this woman I had never met, standing in a hallway I had built with my own money, telling me when I was allowed to love my grandchild. Behind her, through the half-open nursery door, I could see Oliver sleeping in the crib I had ordered the week he was born. "Of course," I said. I smiled. "Whatever's best for the baby." Roxanne nodded and closed the nursery door between us. The latch clicked with the clean precision of a lock being tested. I walked back to my study. I sat in the chair where I had signed 10,000 loans and turned down 5,000 more. And I did what I have always done when something does not add up. I started counting, because 44 years of reading balance sheets had taught me one unbreakable rule. Nobody limits your access to something precious unless they are planning to use it against you. And nobody hires a stranger to stand between a grandfather and his grandchild unless they are hiding something far worse behind her. So I started looking. Not asking. Looking. There is a difference. And 44 years of banking taught me which one gets you the truth. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you saw a man with zero income pull into your driveway in a brand new $90,000 SUV and expect you not to notice that? It was early September when Tamara came home in a black Cadillac Escalade, the kind of vehicle that costs more per month than most families in Millbrook spend on their mortgage. She parked it next to my 12-year-old pickup on the gravel drive and stepped out carrying shopping bags from stores I had never heard of. Were sunglasses that probably cost more than the groceries inside those bags. She walked past me on the porch without breaking stride. "It's a lease, Dad," she said. "The way you say something you have already decided is not a discussion. Garrett says we need to look professional for client meetings." "Of course," I said. "Appearance matters in business." I watched her walk inside. Then I looked at the tires. Continental. Premium all season. I estimated the monthly payment before she reached the front door. $1,400, give or take. For a family with no declared income, living rent-free in my house, eating food from my kitchen. I want you to understand something about how a banker's mind works. We do not hear words, we hear numbers. And the numbers your mouth makes had better match the numbers on the page, because the moment they stop matching, I stop listening to your words and start reading your receipts. Over the following weeks, Garrett began taking phone calls at odd hours. He would step onto the back porch at 9 in the evening, or excuse himself during breakfast, always turning his body away, always lowering his voice to that low register men use when they do not want the walls to carry what they are saying. I never followed him. I never pressed my ear to the door. I did not have to. Sound carries in old houses, and fragments drifted through the hallway like smoke under a door. Restructuring timeline. Collateral adjustment. The principal needs to be repositioned before the end of the quarter. Those are not the words of a man building new client relationships. Those are the words of a man negotiating with people he already owes. One morning I passed him on the back porch as he ended a call. He pocketed his phone too quickly and smiled too broadly. "New clients, Dad," he said. "Boston referrals. Things are turning around." "That's good to hear, son." I smiled back. But no man rebuilding a legitimate business whispers, and no man expecting honest income flinches when his father walks within earshot. A household budget is like a heartbeat. When the rhythm is steady, you do not think about it. You do not count the beats. But when it changes, when the spending accelerates and nobody can explain the new tempo, something inside the system is failing. And the only question left is whether the failure is accidental or designed. Late one evening in September, after Garrett and Tamara had gone to their wing, I sat in the library and did what I had done every working day for 4 decades. I ran the numbers. The Escalade lease $1,400 a month. New clothes appearing in the hallway closet every week, tags still attached, brands I could price from memory. Restaurant receipts left on the kitchen counter from places in Burlington that charged $40 for a steak. A contractor's estimate pinned to the refrigerator for renovating the guest bathroom, $18,000. As if the house they were living in for free needed improvement. And on Garrett's desk, which I passed each morning on my way to the study, a brochure for a private infant academy in Stowe that charged $22,000 a year in tuition. I added every number I could see. I subtracted every dollar of income I could verify. The balance was not just negative, it was impossible. Garrett was spending at a rate that required either a source of money I could not trace or a promise of money that had not arrived yet. A man with a shuttered fund and no employment does not spend like someone expecting nothing. He spends like someone expecting everything. And in my experience, unexplained money always comes with a price that someone else ends up paying. The question was no longer whether my son was hiding something from me. The question was how much, and from whom, and what he planned to do when the bill came due. I closed the ledger in my mind and sat in the dark, listening to the house settle around me, waiting for the next number to reveal itself. The next number did not come from a ledger. It came from the other side of a closed door at 11 minutes past midnight. I could not sleep. The columns I had been running in my head for weeks kept rearranging themselves into shapes I did not like. So I got up for a glass of water and walked the long hallway toward the kitchen in bare feet. The way I have done 1,000 nights since Lorraine died. The hardwood was cold. The house was silent in the way only old houses can be silent, not quiet, but holding something back. Then I heard Tamara's voice. It came through the bedroom door like a crack in glass. Not the polished, measured voice I had grown accustomed to. Not the woman who had stood in my living room and told me I would never hold my grandson. This was something else entirely. Raw. Cornered. The sound your throat makes when it is closing around words you do not want to say. "I don't want to do this to him," she whispered. "He's an old man. He doesn't deserve this." I stopped walking. I pressed my back flat against the hallway wall and held my breath. The floor did not creak. The house, for once, cooperated. "He says there's no other choice," she continued, her voice barely holding together. "He says if we don't get it done before the baptism, they'll come for all of us." A pause. She was listening to whoever was on the other end. Then, quieter still, almost swallowed by the door between us. I know. But what happens to Roxanne if this goes wrong? Have you ever stood in your own hallway, barefoot on cold hardwood at midnight, and heard someone you thought was your enemy sound exactly like a victim? It does something to the architecture of your certainty. Wall you built with evidence and logic suddenly develop cracks, and through those cracks comes something inconvenient. Doubt. I did not move for another 2 minutes. The conversation ended. I heard Tamara set the phone down on the nightstand. And then I heard something I had never heard from her before. A single, suppressed sob. The kind that comes from pressing your face into a pillow so no one hears you breaking. I walked past the door without stopping. I did not get my water. I went to the library, closed the door, and sat in Lorraine's reading chair in the dark. I have spent 44 years sitting across from people in conference rooms, boardrooms, and occasionally living rooms where the furniture was worth more than the honesty in the conversation. I have heard every kind of voice a human being can produce when money is on the table. Confident voices, lying voices, angry voices rehearsing speeches they wrote in the car, and frightened voices. Voice that crack not because the person wants something from you, but because someone else wants something from them. You can fake confidence. You can fake anger convincingly enough to fool most people in a room. But you cannot fake the sound of a throat closing around a word it does not want to release. That sound is involuntary. It comes from a place below strategy, below performance, below the part of the brain that knows how to lie. Tamara's voice had that sound. She was not scheming. She was terrified. Who were they? And what kind of people put a deadline on a baptism? Not for the sake of a child's soul, but for the sake of a signature. I sat in that dark library and dismantled every assumption I had built over the past 2 months. I had been constructing a clean theory my son and his wife were conspiring to access the trust fund, using the baby as leverage and the nanny as a gatekeeper. Simple. Ugly, but simple. The kind of financial betrayal I had seen 100 times across my desk. But Tamara's midnight call rewrote the equation. If she was being coerced, then Garrett was not merely defrauding his father. He was also controlling his wife. And the people he referenced, the ones who would come for all of us, were not family. They were not business partners. They were something with enough weight to make a woman like Tamara, who could deliver an ultimatum to a room full of guests without blinking, weep alone into her pillow at midnight. I sat until the first gray light crept through the curtains. Turning one question over like a coin I could not stop flipping. Was I fighting to protect my family from my son? Or was I fighting to protect all of us from something my son had already lost control of? Either way, I needed answers that would not come from listening through doors. I needed proof. And proof, in my experience, always starts with the person nobody thinks you are watching. The person nobody thinks you are watching is always the one who tells you the most. And in my house, that person was the nanny. I did not plan to test her. It happened the way most useful accidents happen. A thought surfaced at the wrong moment, and my mouth moved before my judgment could catch it. I was in the nursery during my allotted 30 minutes in early October, holding Oliver's bottle at the angle he preferred, when a name I had glimpsed weeks earlier on a crumpled form in the kitchen recycling bin slipped out. "Could you hand me that burp cloth?" Rachel. Roxanne Platt's entire body stiffened. It lasted half a second, less than the time it takes to blink. Her shoulders drew up. Her fingers stopped mid-reach, and something behind her eyes rearranged itself the way a card player's face rearranges when the wrong suit lands on the table. Then she smiled. A smile that traveled no further than her lips. "It's Roxanne, Mr. Ashford," she said, too fast, too firm. The correction of someone protecting a boundary, not clarifying a mistake. "Just Roxanne." "I'm sorry," I said, letting my voice carry the weight of a man embarrassed by his own aging mind. "My memory's not what it used to be." She nodded and handed me the cloth. Her fingers brushed mine, and they were cold. Not from the room temperature, from the effort of staying still. A wrong name is like a misplaced decimal on a balance sheet. Most people glance past it, catch nothing, move on. But to someone who spent a lifetime catching those decimals before they became million-dollar errors, it screams louder than anything else on the page. That flinch was not surprise. It was recognition. The name I had used was hers. Or it had been. And the fact that she was standing in my grandson's nursery under a different one told me something no resume ever would. I finished my 30 minutes. I kissed Oliver's forehead. I handed him back to the woman whose name I now knew was not really Roxanne. And I walked to my library with the particular calm of a man who has just confirmed that the lock on his front door was picked months ago. 4 days later, my phone rang. My daughter, Ivy Ashford Redmond, 32, worked as an insurance fraud investigator in Burlington. She spent her professional life proving that people lied for money, forged claims, staged accidents, doctored records. She was quiet, methodical, and she had inherited her mother's ability to hear the false note in a sentence before it finished landing. She had also. I was learning, inherited her father's habit of watching her brother from a distance and keeping what she saw in a file she hoped she would never have to open. "Dad, I need to tell you something," she said. No greeting, no small talk. Ivy did not waste words the way her brother wasted money. "I'm listening." "His fund didn't fail because of the market." Her voice was careful, the way you handle a glass you know is already cracked. "A friend at Barlow Capital in Boston told me there was an internal investigation. Fabricated returns." Garrett was inflating performance reports to attract new investors. He wasn't caught by the market. He was caught by auditors. Your children do not come with audited financial statements. You raise them. You teach them. You hand them your values like keys to a house you hope they will away, and reads you the audit results on your son. And you sit in the chair where you built your career on honesty, and realize that the boy who grew up watching you verify every number learned the wrong lesson from it. He did not learn to be truthful. He learned how truth is constructed, and then he learned to counterfeit it. How long have you suspected? I asked. Since he showed up with 4 suitcases and a story that sounded like a press release instead of the truth. I closed my eyes. My daughter had seen it from Burlington. I had been sleeping 2 doors down and needed months to stop making excuses for what my own instincts were telling me. That evening, I sat in the library connecting 2 facts that, separately, could each be explained away. A nanny flinching at a name that was not supposed to be hers. A son whose career ended not from misfortune but from fraud. Put them on the same ledger and they stopped being coincidences. They became architecture. The woman guarding my grandson was chosen, not hired. And the man who chose her had come home not because he was humbled, but because he was running. My daughter did not know it yet, but she had just handed me the first piece of a picture I would spend the next 5 weeks wishing I never had to see in full. Architecture requires a blueprint, and now that I could see the shape of what was being built inside my own house, I needed to understand what it was designed to take from me. I did not have to wait long. Garrett delivered the news in mid-October, 4 weeks before the baptism, standing outside the nursery door like a sentry who had been waiting for me to arrive. He had that rehearsed posture men adopt when they are about to say something they have practiced weight on the back foot. Chin slightly raised, hands loose at his sides. Roxanne stood behind him in the doorway, clipboard angled against her chest, eyes fixed on a point somewhere above my shoulder. Dr. Harmon says exclusive caregiver bonding in the first year is critical, Garrett said. His voice was level, clinical, the voice of a man reading a prescription label. No unsupervised visits for now, Dad. It's temporary. Roxanne will manage the schedule. I looked at my son. I looked at the woman behind him whose name was not her own. And I looked, through the gap between them, at the crib where my grandson was sleeping under a blanket Lorraine had knitted 3 months before she died. A blanket she made for a grandchild she would never meet, stitched with a patience I was now being told I could no longer exercise in person. Of course, son, I said. Whatever's best for the baby. Garrett nodded. Roxanne closed the nursery door. The latch clicked with the same clean precision it had the first time she shut it in my face. And my son walked away without looking back. There was no Dr. Harmon. There was no appointment. There was no medical reason on this earth for what my son had just done. And somewhere behind those rehearsed eyes, he knew it the moment the words left his mouth. I confirmed it within the hour. From my library. I called the only pediatric practice in Millbrook. The receptionist was polite, thorough, and entirely unhelpful in the way I needed her to be. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford," she said. "We don't have that name in our system. Are you sure you have the right practice?" I thanked her. I hung up. I set the phone on the desk beside the framed photograph of Lorraine and me at the bank's 25th anniversary dinner. And I sat very still for a long time. The excuse was fabricated. Not bent, not exaggerated. Invented whole from nothing. The way my son had apparently learned to invent profit reports for investors who trusted him. The pattern was the same: construct a plausible surface, deliver it with confidence, and count on the listener being too polite or too trusting to check the second page. But I always checked the second page. If you have ever loved a child so much that the thought of not holding them makes your chest physically ache, then you already understand the weapon they were building. If you have not, let me explain it in the language I know best. In banking, the most effective form of leverage is not what you take from someone. It is what you threaten to withhold. You do not rob a man at gunpoint and expect his cooperation. You find the thing he cannot live without. You hanging on it gently, and you let him see that your hand is there. Then you wait. That is what my son was doing with Oliver. The 30-minute restriction was the first touch. This, the complete severance dressed in medical language, was the tightening of the grip. And somewhere ahead, a date I could not yet see, but could feel approaching like a change in air pressure. There would be the demand. Sign something, transfer something, surrender something. And the price of refusal would be the one thing I had left in this world that made the silence of this house bearable. They were not protecting my grandson from me. They were separating me from the only thing on this earth I would never voluntarily give up. And the cruelty of it was not that they were doing it. The cruelty was that they were doing it slowly, methodically, with the patience of people who believed I was too old to see the mechanism turning. I sat in that library until the light faded and the room went dark around me. I did not turn on the lamp. I did not pour a drink. I did not call Ivy. I sat with my hands on the arms of the chair, where I had made 10,000 decisions that built a career on seeing what others missed. And I made one more. I stopped being a father trying to understand his son. And I became something my son had never accounted for. A man who had finally decided to fight back. Fighting back and swinging blindly are not the same thing. I have watched men confuse them my entire career, and every single one of them lost. Do you know what separates a man who loses everything from a man who takes it all back? It is not strength. It is not money. It is the discipline to sit still when every nerve in your body is screaming at you to move. That night, after the nursery door closed on me for what I knew would be the last time until I changed the terms, I sat in the library and let the rage run through me like a current through a wire. I felt it in my hands, in my jaw, in the place behind my sternum where Lorraine used to press her palm when she could tell I was about to say something I would regret. I wanted to walk upstairs, slam open my son's door, and demand answers. I wanted to hear his voice break the way it used to break when he was 12, and I caught him lying about where he had been after school. I wanted to watch him try to explain the nanny, the phantom doctor, the sealed nursery, the whispered phone calls, while I stood in the doorway and let him see that his father was not the confused old man he had been performing for. But I have spent 44 years watching men do exactly that. In conference rooms, in boardrooms, in living rooms where the furniture cost more than the truth. The partner who accused too early. The client who slammed his fist on my desk before he understood the contract he was breaking. The investor who stormed out of a meeting because his pride could not tolerate another 10 minutes of listening. Every one of them showed their hand before they understood the full table. And every one of them walked away with less than they came in with. I want you to understand something about me before I go any further in this story. I have never once in my life made a move before I understood exactly what I was dealing with. Not in business, not in marriage, not in the quiet, private mathematics of grief. Lorraine would have said the same thing she always said when she could see me calculating behind my eyes. You don't swing at a man until you know exactly how far he can fall. She was right about most things. She was right about that. Rage is a luxury for men who do not need to win. I needed to win, so I pulled a legal pad from my desk drawer. The same brand I have used since I opened the bank. Yellow, ruled. The kind that smells faintly of wood pulp and intention. I uncapped a pen, and I did what I had done 10,000 times across 4 decades. When the numbers stopped making sense, and the people behind them started lying. I built a risk assessment matrix. Column 1, what I knew. The nanny was operating under a false name. My son's career ended in fraud, not misfortune. My daughter-in-law was frightened of someone she referred to as they. My access to my grandson was being systematically eliminated. Column 2, what I suspected. Garrett owed money to people outside the family. The nanny was connected to those people, or to his scheme. The baby was being positioned as emotional leverage for a financial demand I had not yet received. Column 3, what I needed to prove. Everything. A legal pad and a sharp pencil may not look like weapons. But I built an entire institution with nothing more than those tools, and the willingness to use them patiently. And I intended to dismantle whatever my son had constructed with the same discipline. In banking, we called this a distressed asset review. You identify the exposure, quantify the risk, map the stakeholders, and build a response plan before the debtor knows you are looking. I never imagined the distressed asset would carry my last name and sleep 2 floors above me. By the time the first light came through the library windows, I had 3 pages filled. 3 phases. Phase 1. Verify the nanny's real identity through channels outside this house. Phase 2. Trace Garrett's financial trail through someone I trusted at the bank. Phase 3. Secure legal counsel from the one man in Millbrook who owed me nothing but the truth. I tore the pages from the pad, folded them into my jacket pocket, and locked the desk drawer. Then I washed my face, combed my hair, and walked to the kitchen. By the time Garrett came downstairs for his morning coffee, I was sitting at the table with the newspaper open to the crossword, reading glasses low on my nose, king exactly like the tired, confused old man he needed me to be. He poured his coffee without glancing at me twice. The investigation had already begun, and he would never see it coming. Phase 2 began the next morning. I told Garrett I had an advisory board meeting at the bank, which was true, in the sense that I was walking into the building where I still held a seat. The meeting I actually intended to have was not on any calendar. I had walked through the front door of Ashford Private Trust 10,000 times across 44 years. I knew the sound the hinges made in winter when the cold tightened the brass. I knew the smell of the lobby old wood, fresh paper, and the faint sweetness of the mints the tellers kept in a dish by the window since 1994. But this was the first time I walked in hoping the numbers would prove me wrong about my own blood. Celeste Greer, 34, sat behind the desk that used to be mine. Vice President now. A title she had earned across 12 years of working harder than anyone else on the floor. I had hired her out of a state college accounting program when she was 22, and I had spent the next decade teaching her the one thing no textbook covers: how to read the person behind the numbers. Not just the numbers themselves. She was the closest thing I had to a professional heir. And on that morning, she was the only person in the world I trusted enough for what I was about to ask. I closed her office door. I sat in the client chair. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when I was training her to spot a bad loan. Attentive, patient, already 2 steps ahead. Except this time, the bad loan was sitting at my kitchen table every morning, calling me Dad. I need you to look into my son's finances, I said. Quietly. No flags, no reports, just you and me. She did not ask why. She did not hesitate. She turned to her screen, and her fingers were already moving before I finished the sentence. How far back? She asked. As far as it takes to find what I'm afraid is there. Within an hour, the first threads appeared. High-interest transfers routed through 3 shell accounts with names that meant nothing, initials and numbers. The kind of naming convention people use when they want the money to move without a face attached to it. Celeste traced the routing backwards, account by account, until all 3 paths converged on a single private lending entity registered in Boston with no physical office, no listed principals, and no public filings. By afternoon, she had the full exposure. Let me tell you what $1.1 million in underground debt sounds like when someone says it out loud in a quiet office. It sounds like the exact distance between a desperate man and whatever he is willing to destroy to survive. It is not a number that appears on bank statements. It is a number that appears in conversations held in parking lots and back rooms, negotiated by men who do not send collection letters because they do not need to. 1.1 million? Celeste said, her voice careful in the way voices get when the person speaking knows the weight of what they are holding. And these aren't bank rates. These are the kind of numbers people charge when they know you can't go to a legitimate lender. I stared at the screen. 3 shell accounts, 1 destination, 0 payments. Can you tell where the repayments were supposed to come from? I asked. That's what worries me. She scrolled down. The column where payment history should have been was empty. There are no payments. Not a single one. Whoever lent him this money is still waiting. Still waiting. That phrase sat in the room between us like a held breath. People who lend money underground do not wait because they are patient. They wait because they are calculating. They wait because they know that pressure, applied at the right moment, produces better returns than any interest rate. I sat in the chair where clients had sat across from me for 4 decades, asking me to protect their assets from exactly this kind of exposure. And now the exposure was mine. A man who owes that sum to people who do not file lawsuits does not need a paycheck. He does not need a new job or a business plan or a second chance. He needs a single, large, liquid asset he can drain fast enough to make the debt disappear before the people holding it lose their patience. I looked at Celeste, and I could see she had already arrived at the same calculation. There was only one asset in our family large enough to cover that number, and my son had been circling it since the day he came home with 4 suitcases and a story about the market. Now I knew what my son was circling. The trust. The only asset large enough to make his debt disappear, but knowing the target was not enough. I needed to understand the mechanism how he planned to reach it, and who he had put in place to help him get there. The answer came from a laundry basket. The envelope was lying face up on the laundry room floor in late October, half hidden behind a basket of the baby's clothes. A plain bank envelope, the kind that holds a check stub or a deposit receipt. I almost stepped over it the way you step over anything that looks like it belongs to someone else's life. But the name printed on the front did not belong to anyone in my house. It did not say Roxanne Platt. I did not pick it up right away. I stood there for a full 10 seconds, reading the name through the clear window of the envelope. Let it settle into the column in my mind where I had been stacking every piece of evidence since September. Then I pulled my phone from my pocket, knelt slowly the way a 70-year-old man kneels when his knees have opinions about it, and photographed both sides, front, back, the check stub visible through the window. I replaced the envelope exactly where it had fallen, nudged the basket back to its original position, and walked away. Evidence is like a loose thread on a tailored suit. Most people tuck it back in and forget it. But a man who has been pulling threads for 4 decades knows that one careful tug can unravel the entire garment. The most important thing you can do with proof is make sure nobody knows you have found it. That evening, I sat in the library and texted the photograph to Ivy, one line beneath it, "Can you run this through your industry contacts?" She replied within 3 minutes. My daughter, the fraud investigator, did not need context. A photograph of a stranger's name sent by her father at 10 in the evening carried its own explanation. "Dad, where did you get this name?" "From someone who shouldn't have it." "How fast can you check?" "Give me 48 hours. She needed 36. The call came on a Thursday evening. I was sitting in the library with the door closed, the way I'd been sitting most evenings since this began, listening to the house, cataloging footsteps, tracking which doors opened and closed after midnight. "I found her," Ivy said. No preamble. Her voice had the tight, controlled quality of a woman who has spent her career uncovering lies and has just found one living in her father's house. 18 months in a Maryland correctional facility. 3 staged insurance claims. 2 fabricated injuries. One, a supposed slip on a client's property. The other, a car accident with doctored medical records. She had pleaded guilty, served her time, and upon release, changed her name and relocated to New England. The woman standing in my grandson's nursery every day, holding him, feeding him, controlling who could enter the room and when, was not a certified childcare professional. She was a convicted fraud specialist with documented experience in staging false incidents for money. Her real name is Rachel Voss, Ivy said. It matched her original conviction record exactly. She's not a nanny, Dad, Ivy said. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. No, I said. She's exactly what Garrett needed her to be. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear for a long time after Ivy hung up. The house was quiet. Somewhere above me, the woman with two names was sleeping in the room next to my grandson's nursery. My son was sleeping in the room at the end of the hall, and my daughter-in-law was sleeping or not sleeping beside a man who had brought a convicted criminal into our home and placed her between a grandfather and a baby like a lock on a door. They did not hire a nanny. They hired an actress, a woman with a proven record of constructing false scenes for profit, operating under a name she had buried in another state's court records. And if my son had gone to the trouble of finding someone with that exact skill set, someone who knew how to stage an incident, fabricate a scenario, make something look real that was entirely manufactured, then whatever he was planning was not just financial fraud anymore. It was a performance, something designed to be witnessed, believed, and acted upon before anyone could question whether it had actually happened. And my grandson, the 7-month-old boy with his grandmother's eyes, who could not yet speak a single word in his own defense, was the prop at the center of it. A stage performance needs a script, a cast, and a stage. I now knew the cast. The script was still hidden. But before I went looking for it, something told me to check what I had already assumed was safe. There are things in a man's life that have no dollar value. They sit in locked boxes not because they are worth stealing, but because they are worth remembering. My father's pocket watch was one of them. 18-karat gold case, Swiss movement, initials engraved on the back in a jeweler's hand that has been dead longer than most people reading this have been alive. My father carried it through Korea. He wound it every morning in a foxhole outside Chosin and every morning after for the next 40 years. He gave it to me on my wedding day, pressed it into my palm, and said, "Give this to the next man in this family who earns the right to carry time." I had planned to give it to Oliver on his 18th birthday. That week after Garrett and Tamara left for what they called a meeting in Burlington, I climbed the stairs to the master bedroom closet, where the fireproof safe had sat since Lorraine chose the combination 30 years ago. Our wedding date, reversed. She picked it because she said anyone who knew us well enough to guess it deserved whatever was inside. She never imagined that person would be our own son. I knelt in front of the safe. My knees protested the way they always do now, and the carpet smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Lorraine used to tuck into the closet shelves. I turned the dial. The mechanism clicked open the way it had 1,000 times. Passport. There. Insurance binder, undisturbed. The manila envelope with our original deed, still sealed. I reached to the back corner where the small velvet pouch had sat for decades, tucked behind a stack of savings bonds I had bought in Oliver's name the week he was born. My hands had signed 10,000 loan documents without trembling. They had held Lorraine's palm the morning she stopped breathing without letting go. But when my fingers closed around that velvet pouch and felt it collapse empty, flat, weightless, they shook like they belonged to someone I did not recognize. I pulled the pouch out and opened the drawstring. Nothing inside. Not the watch. Not the small square of tissue paper I had wrapped it in. Not even the faint impression of weight that objects leave behind when they have rested in the same place for years. Just fabric and air. He had guessed the combination. Or Tamara had. Or they had found it written somewhere in Lorraine's things, in her handwriting, in the private shorthand of a marriage they had no right to read. However they got in, the result was the same. My father's watch. The one object in this house that connected 4 generations of men in a single, unbroken line, was gone. I sat on the edge of the bed. The same bed where Lorraine slept beside me for 37 years. I held the empty pouch between my palms and pressed it the way you press a wound when there is nothing else to do. Money I could recover, accounts I could freeze, Legal documents I could void with a single phone call to the right attorney. But some things carry the fingerprints of people who are gone. And once those are taken, no court on earth can put a price on what you have actually lost. That watch held the warmth of my father's hand. It held the sound of Lorraine's laugh when she said it was the most impractical wedding gift she had ever seen. It held mornings I could not get back, in a kitchen that no longer smelled like coffee for two. And my son had taken it from a dead woman's safe, in a dead woman's bedroom, using a dead woman's combination, and carried it out of this house like it was currency. Something shifted inside me. Not rage. I had passed through rage weeks ago and come out the other side into something more useful. This was colder. This was the sound a door makes when it closes for the last time. When the person closing it knows they will never open it again. The last thread of hesitation I had been holding, the small, stubborn filament of hope that my son might still have some honest part of him left, snapped. I placed the empty pouch back in the safe. I closed the door. I stood up. Whatever Garrett was building inside my home, I was going to tear it down completely. And I was going to start by finding the blueprints he thought nobody would ever look for. I found the blueprints 2 days later. In the room where Lorraine used to read poetry on Sunday afternoons, Garrett had converted it into his office when he moved in. Pushed her reading chair into the corner, replaced her floor lamp with a desk lamp, and covered the windowsill where she kept her bookmarks with stacks of manila folders. I noticed that. I noticed everything now. The room still smelled faintly of the lemon oil she used on the shelves, and walking into it felt like trespassing in a memory. The desk drawer was not even properly locked. A cheap brass latch, the kind you find at a hardware store for $3. The kind a man installs when he assumes nobody in the house would ever think to look. It gave way with one firm pull. My son had spent months constructing an elaborate scheme to extract my fortune, and he had protected the evidence of it with a fastener I could have opened with a butter knife. Arrogance. That is what it was. The same arrogance that made him think he could fabricate investment returns and not get caught. The same arrogance that made him bring a convicted criminal into his father's house and expect no one to notice. Garrett did not lock that drawer tightly because it never occurred to him that the confused old man shuffling past his door every morning was anything other than what he appeared to be. Inside the drawer, beneath a stack of utility statements and an expired auto insurance card, sat a manila folder. Thick, professional. The kind of folder that holds something a lawyer prepared and a client paid for. I opened it. 32 pages. Professionally typeset. Legal language I could read as fluently as my own handwriting after 4 decades in private banking. A complete transfer of the Ashford family trust, every dollar, every asset, every instrument within it, into the sole name of my son. The notarized sections were pre-filled. Witness lines were blank but formatted. The routing instructions for the receiving account were already printed at the bottom of page 28. $3.2 million. One signature line left empty on the final page, and a yellow sticky note pressed to the margin beside it. Written in Garrett's handwriting, 2 words that told me exactly when they planned to put the pen in my hand. Before baptism. Not a reminder. A deadline. I stood in my dead wife's reading room holding the document that proved my son had been planning to rob me since the day he came home. Not a desperate improvisation. Not a panicked grab at money by a man in over his head. This was architecture, drafted by a lawyer, timed to a ceremony. Dan's to extract a signature from a man they believed was too old, too grief-stricken, and too dependent on his grandson's presence to say no. The baptism was not a celebration. It was a closing date. How long does it take a man to photograph 32 pages of his own betrayal? I can tell you exactly. 9 minutes. And every one of them felt like holding my breath underwater. I set each page on the desk, photographed it front and back with my phone, and replaced it in the folder in the exact order I found it. I checked the alignment of the sticky note. I made sure the folder sat at the same angle in the drawer, beneath the same utility statements, with the same crease in the insurance card resting on top. I pushed the drawer closed until the brass latch caught. I did not take anything. I did not leave a trace. 44 years of handling sensitive documents had taught me the first rule of evidence. Let it stay where it is until you are ready to use it in front of the right audience. The second rule is simpler. Never let the person who created the evidence know you have seen it, because the moment they know, they start building a new story to explain it away. I walked out of Garrett's office and pulled the door closed behind me. The hallway was quiet. The house held its late October silence. The kind where the heating system clicks on and off like a metronome counting down to something. I had the nanny's criminal record. I had the financial trail. I had the trust transfer documents with a baptism deadline written in my son's own hand. 3 columns of evidence, each one sufficient on its own to prove intent. And together, they formed something no lawyer could dismiss and no jury could ignore. Now I had the blueprints. Every wall, every beam, every load-bearing lie my son had engineered under my roof. What I needed next was someone who knew how to turn those blueprints into a cage. And I knew exactly where to find him. The man I needed was sitting in a corner booth 30 minutes outside Woodstock with black coffee he had not touched, and the unhurried stillness of someone who has spent a lifetime listening before he speaks. Vernon Sinclair, 72, had spent 40 years putting people in prison for the federal government. He had prosecuted fraud cases that made the front page of the Boston Globe, and extortion cases that never made the papers at all. Retirement had done absolutely nothing to dull the edge in his voice or the precision in his thinking. He was also the man who had stood beside me without speaking a single word at Lorraine's funeral, and then driven me home afterward, and sat in my kitchen until midnight, because he understood that silence, shared properly, is louder than any eulogy. I had called him the night before and said only, "I need to show you something." He did not ask what. He named the diner and the time. He did not say a word for the first 11 minutes. I laid everything on the Formica table between us. The phone photographs of the trust transfer documents, Ivy's report on the nanny's criminal history, the financial trail Celeste had traced through 3 shell accounts. I pointed to the sticky note on the signature page. I explained the fabricated pediatrician. I described the midnight phone call, where Tamara wept about people who would come for all of us. Vernon stirred his coffee. He never drank it. He studied each photograph with the unhurried focus of a man reading a case file he already knows will go to trial. "How long have you been carrying this alone?" he asked when I finished. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a secret inside your own home. Not the tiredness of sleepless nights, though there had been plenty of those. The tiredness of smiling at people who are planning to rob you while you pass the butter. The tiredness of playing confused when your mind has never been sharper. The tiredness of kissing your grandson's forehead during a supervised 30-minute window, and knowing that the woman counting the minutes has a fraud conviction in another state. "Since September," I said. "Alone since September." Vernon nodded once, set down his spoon, and became the person I had driven 30 minutes to find. "The financial trail alone justifies a warrant application," he said. His voice carried the steady authority of 4 decades of courtroom work. Every word placed with the precision of a man who knows that sloppy language loses cases. I can have it drafted within the week through Mel Dunford at the sheriff's office. He's solid, discreet. And the nanny? A convicted felon operating under a false name in a household with a minor child. That's a separate investigation track. We build both and time them to converge. Converge on what? Vernon looked at me across the table. On whatever they're planning to do at that baptism. If your son has set a deadline, then we set ours one step behind it. We let the performance play out, and we catch every actor on stage. If you have ever had a friend who did not ask why, did not ask what was in it for them, but simply said, "Tell me when and where," Then you know exactly what Vernon Sinclair meant to me in that booth. He was not doing this for money. He was not doing it for professional reputation.
He was doing it because 40 years ago we shook hands outside a courthouse in Montpelier on the day he won his first federal case, and I approved his first mortgage.
And neither of us had ever let go. You stood next to me at Margaret's funeral and didn't say a word. Vernon said as we stood in the gravel parking lot, his hand gripping mine with the firmness of a man making a promise he intended to keep. You just stayed. That's the kind of man I fight for. I drove home through the Vermont hills with the windows down. The October air was sharp enough to taste, carrying the cold mineral smell of the river that runs along Route 4 and the faint sweetness of leaves already turning to mulch on the forest floor. The truck rattled the way it always does over the bridge outside Bridgewater. And for the first time in weeks, the rattle did not bother me. Vernon was building the legal cage. Celeste was watching the money. Ivy was tracing every thread of the nanny's buried past. I was no longer alone in my own house, and I was about to do the one thing my son would never expect from a 70-year-old man he believed was losing his mind. I was going to wire my own home for sound. 9 days before the baptism. I drove 45 minutes to Rutland in my 12-year-old truck and walked into an electronics store that smelled like packing foam and fluorescent lighting. The kid behind the counter could not have been older than 20. He looked at me the way young people look at old men who wander into technology stores politely, patiently. The way you might watch a dog try to open a screen door. I told him I needed 5 wireless cameras with audio capability, a battery backup unit, and whatever cables were necessary to make the whole system work without touching my existing home network. Wildlife cameras, he asked, scanning the shelf behind him. These are more security grade, sir. The deer in Vermont have gotten very bold lately, I said. He did not ask any follow-up questions. I paid in 20s, $640 in cash. No card statement, no digital receipt. No trace that would appear on a shared household account or a bank statement Garrett might see while scrolling through my records on one of his midnight laptop sessions. The kid bagged everything in 2 plastic sacks and wished me luck with the deer. I drove home with the bags on the passenger seat and the strange calm of a man who has just purchased the instruments of his own family's unraveling. That night, I waited. I sat in the library reading the same page of a book I was not absorbing until the house settled into its after-midnight silence, the furnace cycling off, the last door closing upstairs. The stillness that tells you everyone above you has stopped moving. Then I put on my socks, picked up the first camera, and went to work. My fingers had not been this unsteady since the day I signed the founding charter for the bank. But that day, I was building something with my name on it. And tonight I was building something too, just with smaller screws and a far heavier purpose. The first camera went behind the row of books in Garrett's office, angled to capture the desk and the chair where he took his phone calls. The second went above the nursery doorway, concealed inside the housing of a smoke detector I had installed myself 15 years ago. The third covered the main hallway. The fourth watched the kitchen. The fifth went in the sunroom where Garrett paced during his whispered evening calls. Mounted behind a hanging planter Lorraine had put up the year before she died. I followed the installation tutorials on my phone with reading glasses sliding down my nose, kneeling on hardwood floors that punished my knees, and taping wires along baseboards with fingers that did not move as quickly as the instructional video expected them to. I set up a separate Wi-Fi network on a portable hotspot I had bought at the same store, so none of the cameras would appear on the house router. Every connection, every feed, every byte of data ran through a system only I could access. Lorraine would have laughed herself breathless, watching me, a 70-year-old man in his socks at 2 in the morning, squinting at a phone screen, trying to pair a device to a network using a password I had to type 6 times because my thumbs kept hitting the wrong letters. She would have sat on the stairs in her bathrobe and covered her mouth so the sound of her laughter would not carry. And then she would have come down and helped me hold the bracket steady while I screwed it into place. If you have ever watched a man you love through a camera lens while he sleeps in a room down the hall, you know the particular loneliness of protecting someone who does not know they need protecting from someone who does not know they are being watched. On the second night, at 3 in the morning, I sat in my library and opened the monitoring app on my phone, 5 feeds populated one by one. The dark nursery where Oliver slept. The empty office with the desk drawer I had already searched. The still hallway where footsteps would echo in a few hours. The kitchen where I would sit with my newspaper and my performance of confusion. The sunroom where my son whispered to people he did not want me to hear. All 5 were live. All 5 were recording. Every whisper. Every phone call. Every conversation held in rooms my son believed were private was now being captured, time-stamped, and stored on a device locked inside my desk drawer. I checked the angles 3 times. Lorraine would have told me to check them twice, but I was not taking chances. Not anymore. Not with 8 days left. The walls of my house had started listening, and what they recorded over the next week would give me every piece I had been missing. The first recording that mattered arrived on the second night. And the difference between suspecting your son is planning to rob you and hearing him say it in his own voice, in a room you used to read bedtime stories in, is the sound of something inside you that will never fully heal. I locked the library door after midnight and opened the camera app on my phone. The feeds had been running for 31 hours. Most of it was routine Roxanne warming bottles in the kitchen. Tamara carrying laundry past the hallway camera. Garrett eating lunch alone at the table with his phone propped against a glass. I fast-forwarded through it the way I used to scan quarterly reports, scanning for the line that breaks the pattern. 4 hours of domestic footage, compressed into 20 minutes of silent scrolling on a small, bright screen. Then the office camera caught what I was looking for. Timestamp, 10:47 p.m. the previous evening. Garrett is pacing behind his desk. Tamara sits on the desk edge, arms folded, her posture tight. The audio is clear. The camera I placed behind the bookshelf was 18 inches from where my son chose to have this conversation. "Just get him to sign the transfer before the baptism," Garrett said. His voice was low but steady. No hesitation, no guilt in the cadence. "The lenders will leave us alone once they see the money moving." Tamara's voice was smaller. "And if he says no?" "He won't say no." A pause. My son stopped pacing and looked at his wife. "Not after what happens to the baby." 37 seconds. That is how long it takes to hear your own son describe your grandchild as a line item on a negotiation strategy. 37 seconds to confirm every number on the ledger I had been building for months. 37 seconds to understand, with the kind of certainty that leaves no room for appeals, that the boy Lorraine and I raised is gone, and the man who replaced him is someone I would have refused a loan to across my own desk. I replayed the clip. I do not know why. The words did not rearrange themselves the second time. They did not soften or reveal some hidden context that might explain away what I had heard. Not after what happens to the baby. That sentence landed the same way each time. Flat, clinical, final. The voice of a man who has already made a decision and is simply informing his wife of the schedule. I played it a third time. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted there to be an inflection I missed, a word I misheard. Some thread I could pull that would unravel the meaning into something less monstrous than what it plainly was. There was nothing. The audio was clean. The words were exact. My son had said them the way he used to say everything that mattered to him, without flinching, without looking back. I looked at Lorraine's photograph on the bookshelf, and I wanted to apologize to her. Not for what Garrett had become that was beyond either of us now, but for what I was about to do to him. She would never have the chance to tell me whether I was right, or whether there was some door I had not tried, some conversation I had not attempted, some version of mercy I was too angry to see. She was gone. And the decision was mine alone. and the weight of it sat on my chest like a stone that had been waiting for me to stop moving long enough to feel it. I set the phone face down on the desk. I could not look at the frozen frame of my son's face anymore. The face Lorraine used to cup between her palms when he was small. The face she kissed every night until he was old enough to be embarrassed by it. The face that had just said the words that separated him, permanently and irreversibly, from the man I had spent 70 years hoping he would become. I sat in the dark library until the timestamp on the camera app crossed 3 in the morning. The house was silent. My grandson was asleep upstairs, in a room monitored by a camera his father did not know existed, guarded by a woman with a criminal record, part of a plan that used his existence as currency. I had never wished so badly to be wrong about anything in my life. But the cameras do not lie, and neither did the next recording, the one that arrived the following night from the hallway camera and the nursery feed. Back to back. That would change not just what I knew about the plan, but what I understood about who in that house was truly driving it. The next night delivered 2 recordings. The first broke my assumptions apart. The second rebuilt them into something far worse. The hallway camera caught Tamara at 11:23 p.m., 7 days before the baptism. She was sitting on the floor outside the nursery in bare feet, her back against the wall, both hands pressed over her mouth. The audio picked up what her hands could not contain, a ragged, suppressed sobbing that came from somewhere deeper than performance. I know what performed grief sounds like. I have watched people cry across my desk for 4 decades, and I can tell you the difference between tears that want something and tears that cannot stop themselves. Tamara's were the second kind. "I can't do this to him," she whispered to no one. The hallway was empty. She did not know a camera was watching. Not with her, not with the baby. A pause. She pressed her forehead against her knees. "If we don't do it, they'll come for all of us. He promised me it would be over after this. He promised." I want you to sit with that for a moment. A woman on a cold hallway floor in the middle of the night, whispering apologies to a man who cannot hear her, for a crime she has not committed yet but knows she cannot stop. I had spent weeks thinking of Tamara as an architect of this scheme. The camera told me a different story. She was not building the trap. She was locked inside it. That did not make her innocent, but it made her something more complicated than an enemy. And complications are what separate the cases that end cleanly from the ones that leave scars on everyone involved. And complications are what separate the cases that end cleanly from the ones that leave scars on everyone involved. The second recording arrived the following night, and this one left no room for complication at all. The office camera captured Garrett and Roxanne at the desk, 6 days before the baptism, sitting across from each other with the posture of 2 colleagues reviewing a project timeline. No emotion, no hesitation. The clinical efficiency of people who have reduced a human being to a scheduling problem. "You take him to the garden around 2, Garrett said, leaning back in the chair. "Come back inside without him. Give it 5 minutes, then say he's gone." "How long do I keep it going?" Roxanne asked. Her voice was steady, professional. The voice of a woman who had done this kind of work before. 40 minutes. Enough for him to panic. Enough for him to sign anything I put in front of him. 40 minutes. That was the number. 40 minutes of a grandfather believing his grandchild has vanished from a baptism reception and in that window. While my hands shook and my mind collapsed and every rational faculty I possessed drowned in the particular terror of a missing child. They planned to slide a document in front of me and watch me sign away everything I had built. I sat in my library watching both recordings back to back. Tamara's tears, then Garrett's script. The blue light of my phone was the only illumination in the room, and it painted the walls the color of a surgical theater. 2 sides of the same scheme. One terrified, one calculating. One woman who could not sleep because of what she had been told to do. One man who slept perfectly because he had already decided to do it. My grandson was never going to be harmed. I understood that now with a clarity that cut through every worst-case scenario I had been carrying since September. The baby would be hidden, not hurt. Roxanne would take him somewhere nearby, hold him for 40 minutes, and bring him back once the signature was on the page. Aller was not in physical danger, but what they were planning was worse in a way I had not anticipated. They were not threatening to harm my grandson. They were going to weaponize the worst 40 minutes of my life into a signature. My fear, my love, my inability to think clearly while believing the last living piece of Lorraine had disappeared from a garden full of guests who could not help me. That was the real instrument, not the transfer documents, not the pre-filled notary sections. The instrument was my own heart, and they had spent months calibrating exactly how to use it. I set the phone on my desk and looked at the dark ceiling. I had their entire script now, every role, every timeline, every word of the performance they intended to stage in my home. At my grandson's baptism, in front of 25 witnesses who would never know the panic they felt was manufactured. Time-stamped. Recorded. Sitting in the palm of my hand. Now I had to decide what to do with it. I decided to let them do it. That sentence deserves its own silence. Because I understand how it sounds. I had the recording. I had the evidence. I could have walked upstairs, played the audio for Garrett, and watched his face collapse. I could have called the sheriff that night and had him arrested before breakfast. But 44 years of taking down men who thought they were smarter than the system had taught me one immovable truth: if you stop a scheme before it executes, the schemer walks. He claims misunderstanding. He produces a lawyer. His wife recants. The evidence gets reframed as a family dispute, and the man who built the trap walks away to build another one. But if you let the trap spring, if you let the man step into his own mechanism, while every camera, every witness, and every legal instrument is already in place around him, he cannot walk away from anything. Because he did it, in front of everyone, on the record. My son had built a beautiful trap. The problem was, he had built it inside a bigger one. Mine. I called Vernon. He arrived within 20 minutes and found me on the back terrace with the notebook I had not used since my last hostile acquisition defense at the bank. A leather-bound planner from 1986 that still had margins clean enough to write in. 2 glasses of bourbon sat on the table. I played the recording without preamble. Vernon listened. His jaw tightened the way it does when the professional in him is restraining the friend. When it finished, he set his glass down and spoke with the careful precision of a man who had built federal cases for 4 decades. Conspiracy to commit unlawful restraint and extortion. Filing false police reports if they call it in. Vermont's a one-party consent state. This recording is admissible. I know. So we take this to Mel Dunford now? No, I said. We take it to him on my terms. My hand froze over the notebook. I had just written the word grandson in the margin, and the pen stopped mid-stroke because the letters suddenly looked less like strategy and more like the name of a child I was gambling with. Over's face. Those wide brown eyes looking up at me. The last time I held him flashed through my mind with the force of something I could not afford to feel right now. For 3 seconds, the strategist disappeared, and there was only a grandfather terrified of what would happen if he miscalculated. Then I picked up the pen and kept writing. Before I tell you what I said to Vernon next, the decision that changed everything, I need to ask you something. If you were in my chair, with that recording, with proof your own son planned to use your grandchild as a bargaining chip, would you turn him in? Or would you let him walk into a trap so complete that every lie came crashing down at once? Comment your answer. A for turn him in. B for let the trap play, and tell me why in a few words. A quick note. The next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact. What matters is the lesson behind it. Because what I told Vernon next is when the real game began. I laid out the counter-strategy. Let the baptism proceed. Let Roxanne take the baby on schedule. Let the panic unfold for exactly as long as Garrett needs to believe his plan is working. But preposition every failsafe. Vernon briefs Mel Dunford to place plainclothes deputies among the guests. Celeste holds the baby safely off-site before the ceremony even begins. And a notarized copy of every recording sits sealed with my attorney. You know this is exactly how you used to take down corporate raiders at the bank, Vernon said quietly. Let them overextend, then close the vault door behind them. The difference is, I said, I never loved any of those raiders. The silence that followed carried 40 years of friendship and the weight of what we both understood I was choosing. Vernon raised the one variable we could not control. Tamara. If she broke down before the baptism, if she warned Garrett, the countertrap collapsed. I made the decision that would cost me the most sleep in the years ahead. I would not approach her. She needed to be genuinely afraid during the staged disappearance for Garrett to believe his plan was working. The guilt of that choice sat on my chest like a hand pressing down. Vernon finished his bourbon, stood, and gripped my shoulder. You're sure about this? I looked at the garden where Lorraine's rose bushes still bloomed every October. I'm sure. After he left, I picked up my phone and dialed my attorney. Richard, I said, I need you to draft a new will, and I need it done before the baptism. There was a pause on the line. I looked at the notebook full of countermoves and felt the absolute certainty that after this, nothing in my family would ever be the same. Richard called back within the hour. The will would be ready in 48 hours. New terms, new beneficiaries. New language that removed every assumption my son had been operating under since he moved back into my house. But the will was not the last domino. There was one more call to make, and this one required a different kind of man. 4 days before the baptism, I drove to a small office suite outside Millbrook where a private investigator I had retained through Vernon's referral kept a desk, a filing cabinet, and the practiced discretion of someone who had spent 20 years working cases that never appeared in court records. I told him what I needed. Not a confrontation, not a warning, just a whisper, delivered through the right back channel to the right people, that the trust fund payout Garrett had been promising his lenders might not arrive on schedule. Make sure they understand, I said. Don't threaten. Don't name me. Just let them do the math on their own. The PI studied me across his desk with the flat appraisal of a man who had heard stranger requests from calmer voices. These aren't patient people, Mr. Ashford. Once they start doubting the payout, your son's timeline shrinks to days. That's exactly how long I need it to be. Have you ever had to make yourself small so someone else would feel big enough to make the worst decision of their life? That is what I did at dinner 3 days before the baptism. I sat at the head of my own dining table, the table where Lorraine served Thanksgiving for 32 consecutive years, and I let my hand tremble holding a soup spoon. Not a dramatic tremor. Just enough for Garrett to notice from the corner of his eye. Just enough for Tamara to glance at my fingers and then look away with something she probably mistook for relief. I asked Tamara about the christening outfit. Did we settle on the white gown or the ivory? I can't seem to remember. Garrett did not look up from his plate. You asked that 10 minutes ago. Dad, the ivory. Mom's old one. Of course, I said. I set the spoon down carefully, as though the weight of it had become uncertain in my grip. Of course, Lorraine would have loved that, across the table. Garrett and Tamara exchanged a glance, quick, satisfied. The kind of look two people share when a variable they have been monitoring is performing exactly as expected. They believed my mind was softening on schedule. They believed the confused old man they needed me to be on baptism day was arriving right on time. The soup was butternut squash. Lorraine's Russie anywhere. Tamara had made it from the card pinned to the kitchen cabinet, and it tasted close enough to break my heart if I had allowed it to. I did not allow it. I ate slowly, performed confusion with my napkin, and watched my son eat his mother's soup in a house he was planning to rob while discussing the christening of a child he intended to use as a weapon. The hardest part was not the trembling hand or the repeated question. It was watching my son smile at my confusion like it was a gift he had been waiting to unwrap. That smile, small, private, directed at his plate, was the smile of a man who believed he was winning. And I needed him to keep believing that. For exactly 3 more days. Garrett excused himself after the main course. Tamara began clearing plates, but before she carried the stack to the kitchen, she paused beside my chair. "Are you really okay, Dad?" she asked. Her voice cracked on the word okay. Not the practiced composure I had seen at the baptism ultimatum months ago. Something else. Something that sounded like the woman on the hallway floor. The one who whispered apologies to a man who could not hear her. For one unguarded second. Tamara looked at me, the way you look at someone you are about to betray and cannot stop yourself from caring about anyway. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said. "Just tired." She nodded and carried the dishes away. I sat alone at the table for a long time. Then, from the hallway, Garrett's voice carried through the doorway, low, urgent, speaking into his phone with the carelessness of a man who assumes the old man at the table has already shuffled off to bed. "It has to be during the reception, not before. And tell her the car needs to be running by 1:15. He had not even bothered to check if I was still sitting there. 1:15. During the reception. The car running. Confident men make mistakes. I just needed 3 more days of his. 1:15. Reception. Car running. I wrote the numbers on the back of a grocery receipt and slipped it into my shirt pocket. Then sat in the dark kitchen until the house went completely silent above me. 3 days compressed into hours. The baptism was tomorrow. I had spent 40 years reading men across boardroom tables. But nothing prepared me for watching my own son on a 4-inch phone screen. Standing in my grandson's nursery at 2 in the morning. The camera feed was sharp. Garrett entered the nursery alone, closing the door behind him with the careful slowness of a man who does not want the latch to click. He walked the room in a measured line, from the crib to the side door, counting under his breath. The audio picked up every word. 11 steps to the side door, he murmured. 12 if she's carrying him. I counted with him. 11 steps. That was how far my son had fallen, a distance you could measure in footsteps across a nursery floor. He stopped beside the crib. Oliver was sleeping. I could see the rise and fall of the blanket Lorraine had knitted, the one with the small imperfection in the corner that she said gave it character. Garrett's hand reached down. It hovered over the baby over his own child fingers, slightly spread, palm open, suspended in the air above Oliver's sleeping face. For 3 seconds, his hand did not move. Something in his posture shifted. A tightness in the shoulders. And for one moment I thought I was watching a man reconsidering everything. Then he pulled his hand back and continued measuring the distance to the window. He looked straight at the ceiling corner where the camera sat behind the smoke detector housing. Straight at the lens. Straight at me. My breath stopped. My fingers locked around the phone. The feed showed his eyes narrowing, his head tilting slightly. The way a man examines something that does not quite belong. 2 seconds. 3. 4. Every chess player knows the moment the board shifts from theory to blood. When the pieces stop being wood and start being people you raised. I was watching that moment happen on a 4-inch screen, and there was nothing I could do from my study except sit perfectly still and wait for my son to either see me or look away. Roxanne appeared in the doorway. "Garrett." Her voice was casual, professional. "The car seat rear-facing, or should I switch it forward for tomorrow?" He turned away from the ceiling. "Forward. He's big enough. And keep the engine running when you pull around. I don't want delays." She nodded and disappeared down the hall. Garrett gave the smoke detector one more glance A glance that lasted half a second but felt like a year, and then followed her out. I exhaled. My hands were shaking the way they had the night I found the empty velvet pouch, and I pressed them flat against the desk until the tremor stopped. She had saved my entire plan and did not even know it. I called Vernon at 2:30. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had not been sleeping either. "We're out of runway," I said. "Everything moves tomorrow or not at all. Mel's people will be in the parking lot by 11:30, Vernon said. His voice carried the steadiness of a man who had coordinated operations like this for decades. "Unmarked. You won't see them unless you know where to look." That's exactly how I need my son to feel about all of this. I hung up and checked the camera feeds one more time. The nursery was still. The hallway was empty. But the kitchen camera caught one last detail I had not expected. Roxanne passing through at 2:40 a.m., pausing at the counter where Oliver's diaper bag sat packed for tomorrow. She unzipped the side pocket, slipped something small inside, and zipped it closed. I rewound the footage and zoomed in as far as the resolution allowed. A burner phone, black case, prepaid. The getaway communication device, staged inside the nursery bag that would travel with the baby tomorrow. The infrastructure was physically in place. Every piece of their plan was now positioned, loaded, and waiting for morning. So was every piece of mine. I set the laptop on Lorraine's side of the bed, the side that still smelled faintly of the lavender lotion she kept on the nightstand, and stared at the ceiling until the first gray light bled through the curtains. The house settled around me, ticking and creaking the way it does when the temperature drops before dawn. In 6 hours, my grandson would be baptized. In 7, my son would try to steal him. And in 8, if every piece held, I would end it all. The morning arrived the way all mornings arrive when you have not slept. Slowly, then all at once, the gray light turning white, and the house filling with sounds that meant there was no more time left to prepare. I dressed in the suit Lorraine had picked out for me 7 years ago. Navy, single-breasted. The one, she said, made me look like a man who still had somewhere important to be. I buttoned the cuffs with steady hands and checked my phone one last time. All 5 camera feeds active, Vernon confirmed. Celeste confirmed. The counter trap was live. The minister's hands were still wet with holy water when I counted heads for the 3rd time. 25 guests arranged in white folding chairs across the garden, candles flickering in glass holders along the stone path, and the November air carrying the faint smoke of oak from the neighbor's wood stove. I spotted Vernon near the back row, seated with the casual ease of a man who belonged there, beyond the garden wall, in the parking area. Mel Dunford's 2 deputies sat in an unmarked sedan that looked like it belonged to a late-arriving guest, and Roxanne stood beside the bassinet, one hand resting on the handle, the other holding her phone beneath the blanket where no one could see the screen. The minister lifted Oliver. My grandson's face scrunched against the cold water, and a small cry escaped him that made several guests laugh softly. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I baptize you Oliver James Ashford. Oliver James. His middle name was Lorraine's father's. My son had remembered that. Even now. Even standing in this garden with a timetable for kidnapping his own child running in his head, Garrett had kept that name. I did not know whether that made it better or worse. The minister handed Oliver to me for the anointing blessing. I held him against my chest and felt the weight of 7 months of life pressing into my sternum. His heartbeat was fast and small against mine. His fingers curled around my lapel. I looked down at his face. Those wide, Ashford eyes, Lorraine's eyes, and I made a promise to God that I meant, in ways the minister standing 3 feet away would never understand. Tamara held the baptismal candle beside me. Her hands were trembling so violently the flame shivered and nearly went out. I watched the wax pool unevenly on one side and drip onto her thumb. She did not flinch. She was so deep inside whatever she was feeling that the heat did not register. Her performance was fracturing before the scheme had even begun. Garrett placed his hand on my shoulder. "He looks just like you did, Dad. Steady, warm. The hand of a man about to rob me." I smiled and nodded the way a proud grandfather should, and I handed Oliver back to his father, and I sat down in my chair and waited for 1:15. It came at 1:10. You think you are ready because you have seen the script. You know the words, the timing, the blocking. You have watched the rehearsal on a 4-inch screen and cataloged every beat of the performance your son designed. But the sound of a woman screaming your grandson's name in a garden full of people you invited into your home rewrites everything your brain thought it had prepared for. "Oliver!" Roxanne's voice split the afternoon like a crack in glass. "Oh God, he's not here! The bassinet is empty!" 25 heads turned. Champagne glasses froze midway to lips. The minister stepped backward into the flower bed. And the chaos that followed was so precisely choreographed, so perfectly calibrated to simulate authentic terror, that even I, the man who had watched the script being written, felt my stomach drop before my mind caught up. Tamara collapsed against the reception table. Genuine or performed, I could not tell anymore. Garrett's voice cut through the noise with the commanding authority of a man taking charge of a crisis he had manufactured. "Nobody leave, nobody move, someone call 911. 1:10. 5 minutes ahead of schedule. My son could not even be patient with his own crime. I stood in the middle of the garden, surrounded by screaming guests and overturned chairs, and I forced myself to look confused, frightened, old. But my eyes were not on the bassinet. They were on the tree line beyond the garden wall, where a dark sedan I had never seen before sat idling with its headlights off. The door opened. A man stepped out, heavy coat, unhurried stride, scanning the property the way someone scans a place they have been told about but never visited. He was not one of Vernon's people. I did not recognize him. But from the way Garrett's panic suddenly stopped being an act, neither did my son. I did not have time to assess the man by the tree line. Garrett's hand closed around my elbow before the last guest had stopped screaming, and he steered me through the side hall toward the library with a grip that had stopped pretending to be gentle. His fingers dug into the fabric of the suit Lorraine had chosen for me, and I let him pull me along, because this was the room I needed him in, and he was delivering himself there without knowing it. The library door locked behind us. The sound of the garden chaos muffled into something distant and underwater. Garrett crossed to the desk. My desk. The one where I had signed the founding charter of the bank and pulled open the second drawer. He produced a manila folder I recognized immediately. The same folder, the same pre-filled notary sections, the same signature line on page 32. He had planted it here before the ceremony. Positioned it the way a surgeon positions instruments before an operation. "Dad, listen to me," he said. His voice carried the urgent tremor of a man whose child has just vanished. And if I had not spent the last week watching him rehearse this exact performance on a hidden camera, I might have believed it. "Oliver gone. I need access to the trust to mobilize a search. The full amount buys us private teams, helicopters, everything we need. Garrett, we should call the police. There's no time for police." He pushed the pen toward me across the desk. "Sign the transfer. I'll handle the rest. That's what family does." I watched my son perform grief the way I had once watched junior bankers perform competence across my own desk. All the right words, the right cadence, the right urgency. None of the weight behind them. His hands shook, but not from fear for his child, from the pressure of the unknown man outside. The man whose arrival had compressed Garrett's timeline from 40 minutes to however many he had left before someone he owed money to walked through that garden gate. I picked up the pen. I let my hand tremble. I let my eyes go unfocused the way they had at dinner 3 nights ago, when I asked about the christening gown twice. And then I set the pen down. But how would the trust money help find Oliver? I asked. I don't understand. Son, explain it to me slowly. Garrett blinked. The question was not in his script. He had expected a frightened old man who would sign whatever was placed in front of him while his grandson was missing. He had not expected questions. The trust liquidates into a cash account, he said, recovering quickly. I redirect it to a recovery firm I've already contacted. They're standing by. Just sign, Dad. Every second you waste is a second Oliver is out there. You already contacted a recovery firm? I let the question sit in the room like smoke. Before he went missing, the silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted them the way I had counted every second since this began, precisely, patiently, the way a man counts when the number is the only thing keeping him from losing control. There it was. The mask did not slip. It shattered. And underneath was someone I had never met who wore my son's face. You know what, Dad, fine. Garrett's voice dropped an octave. The tremor vanished. The grieving father evaporated. And what stood in his place was the man from the office recordings, cold, transactional, speaking to me the way he spoke to people he considered obstacles. You want the truth? That money was supposed to be mine 10 years ago. Mom would have given it to me. You just kept it locked away because controlling people is the only thing you've ever loved. The words hit me the way a fist hits a wall. Not because they were true, but because my son believed they were. And that belief had turned him into the man standing across from me right now. Is that what you think this is about? I asked quietly. Control you. Sign the paper. His voice was flat, final. Or I promise you, you will never see that boy again. Not because someone took him, because I will make sure of it. There it was. The sentence I had been waiting 13 months to hear. The exact words that would elevate every charge Vernon had been building, from financial fraud to criminal extortion, with a custodial threat. Recorded on the wire I had been wearing since the ceremony began. I picked up the pen. Garrett exhaled, and then I set it down again. Looked my son in the eye, and said the 6 words I had been saving since the night I found the empty velvet pouch in Lorraine's safe. I know about the nanny. Garrett. The color left his face like someone had pulled a drain plug. Garrett lunged for the library door. Vernon was already on the other side of it. My old friend filled the doorway with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 4 decades standing between criminals and exits. And the look on his face told my son everything words no longer needed to. Sit down, Garrett, Vernon said. Garrett did not sit down. He looked at me, he looked at Vernon, and for the first time since he had moved back into my house 16 months ago, my son had absolutely nothing rehearsed to say. I walked past both of them, through the hallway, and back into the garden. Vernon followed with Garrett between us, not touching him, not restraining him, just walking close enough that the option of running had been quietly removed from the conversation. 25 guests stood exactly where the panic had scattered them. Overturned chairs, champagne glasses abandoned on the stone wall. The minister stood near the flower bed with his Bible pressed against his chest like a shield. The candles had blown out. The garden smelled like cold wax and dying chrysanthemums, and the sharp sweetness of fear that lingers in a place where people have recently screamed. I walked to the reception table. The portable speaker was still connected from the ceremony music, the playlist Tamara had chosen. The one that had played softly while guests held champagne and pretended a family was not disintegrating around them. I unplugged the cable from the music source and connected my phone. "Everyone, please stay," I said. My voice carried across the garden with a steadiness I did not entirely feel. My grandson is safe. He was never in danger. And what I'm about to play will explain why. Dad. Garrett's voice came from behind me. Stripped. Raw. The animal sound of a man watching his own life end in real time. Don't do this. Have you ever heard your own child's voice say something so ugly that the sound of it rewrites every memory you have of teaching them to speak? I heard it now, not in the recording I was about to play, but in the desperate, broken syllable of that word "don't," spoken by a man who had spent months planning to rob me and was only now, in this garden, understanding that the robbery had been his own. "You did this." "Garrett," I said. "I'm just pressing play." I pressed play. The garden filled with voices. My son's voice, Roxanne's voice, recorded in the office where Lorraine used to read poetry, captured by a camera hidden behind a row of books, time-stamped and crystal clear. The staged disappearance script, the trust fund timeline, the rehearsed panic. Every word of the performance they had built to break a grandfather's heart and extract his signature. 25 faces turned from confusion to horror. The minister lowered his Bible. A woman near the back covered her mouth. Tamara's knees buckled, and she caught herself on the edge of a folding chair. Her eyes locked on the speaker as her husband's recorded voice described the liquidation of everything I had built. Garrett stood motionless. He did not speak. He did not move. He watched his own conspiracy broadcast to every person he had ever known in this town. And there was nothing left inside him to perform. Then the garden gate opened. Celeste walked through carrying Oliver. My grandson was sleeping, wrapped in the ivory baptismal blanket, his face pressed against her shoulder with the perfect indifference of a child who has no idea what the adults in his life have done.
"He's been with me since 6 this morning,"
Celeste said, her voice steady as granite. "Slept right through it." She placed him in my arms. Oliver weighed 7 pounds against my chest, the exact weight of proof that some things are worth burning your whole family to protect. His heartbeat pressed into mine, small and fast. And I held him the way I should have been allowed to hold him every day for the past 3 months. Mel Dunford's deputies stepped forward from the crowd. Roxanne was cuffed first, near the garden wall, without a word. Then Garrett. The deputy read the charges in the flat, professional cadence of a man who has done this 1,000 times. Garrett did not look at Tamara. He did not look at his son. He looked at the tree line where the second car had been parked. It was gone. Whoever had been watching from that sedan had seen everything and disappeared. The cruisers pulled away. Gravel crunched. The garden went quiet, and the way only a place that has just witnessed something irreversible goes quiet. Tamara walked toward me with mascara streaking her face and the diaper bag in her hand. She reached into the side pocket and pulled out the burner phone. "There's something on this you need to see," she said. "It's not about Garrett. It's about the people he owes." The burner phone held 11 text messages. No contact names, just dollar amounts, dates, and one line that made Vernon reach for the holster beneath his jacket. The baptism was a nice show. We're outside. Tamara had handed me the phone, with steady hands and terrified eyes. And now Vernon and I stood at the front gate of the estate, watching a dark sedan idle 20 yards down the gravel drive. The passenger window was already down. The driver did not get out. He did not need to. His voice carried in the cold November air the way a debt carries, without apology and without patience. "Your son's problems don't disappear because he's in a cell," the driver said. He was broad-shouldered, maybe 40, with the kind of calm that comes from having made this speech before. 1.1, 5 days. Someone in this family pays, or we find other ways to collect. Vernon stepped forward. "You're threatening a 70-year-old man on a property surrounded by law enforcement. Think about your next sentence carefully." The driver glanced past Vernon to where 2 unmarked cruisers still sat in the church parking area. He said nothing. He rolled the window up. They drove away slowly. The kind of slow that says, "We know where you live, because we are leaving from it." Garrett's debt was like a fire he had set in someone else's house. They did not care that the arsonist was in a cell. They just wanted their walls rebuilt. And his arrest had not neutralized the threat. It had transferred it directly onto me. Onto this property. Onto the family name engraved above the gate those men had just driven past. I'll have Mel's people run the plates,
Vernon said as we walked back up the drive. Fallen leaves stuck to the soles of my dress shoes. The baptism guests were gone.
The caterers were packing their van. Somewhere inside the house. Oliver was sleeping through all of it. Do that, I said. But they'll be clean. Men like that don't drive dirty cars to conversations they planned. In the garden behind the house, where Lorraine's roses had gone dormant for the winter. I sat with Tamara on a wrought iron bench and listened to her tell the truth. He told me if I didn't play along, he'd take Oliver and I'd never see either of them again, she said. Her voice was flat, the flatness of someone who has rehearsed a confession so many times it has worn grooves in her throat. I believed him. I still believe he would have done it. Vernon played the recording of Tamara weeping alone in the nursery for the remaining deputy. No audience in that footage, no performance. Just a woman on a floor, apologizing to someone who was not in the room. The recordings corroborate her account, Vernon told the deputy. Genuine distress, no witnesses, coercion, not conspiracy. Tamara signed the cooperation agreement on the bench where Lorraine used to deadhead roses in August. Financial records, witness statements, everything she knew about the lenders, the staged plan, the timeline Garrett had built around his own child's baptism. I watched her sign and felt no forgiveness. But I understood that some people become accomplices the same way they become prisoners. One locked door at a time. Understanding is not the same as absolving. It is simply the refusal to look away. The deputy left. Vernon left. Tamara went upstairs to wash her face and did not come back down. No camera watching. No timer counting down. No nanny hovering 3 feet away with a clipboard and a 30-minute limit. Just the living room. The last gray light of a November afternoon pressing through the windows, and Celeste Greer walking toward me with my grandson in her arms. He slept through all of it. Mr. Ashford, Celeste said quietly, didn't make a sound the whole time. She placed Oliver against my chest. 7 pounds of warmth. His fingers curled around my thumb with the grip of someone who did not yet know what the world could take from him. And I decided in that moment that he never would. Not on my watch, not in my lifetime, not while this name still meant something. The house smelled like extinguished candles and cold coffee. Oliver smelled like powder and milk and something I could not name except to call it the future. I held him and rocked the chair Lorraine had picked out 30 years ago and spoke to her in silence. Celeste paused in the doorway. Mr. Ashford Garrett called the landline from county lockup about 20 minutes ago. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He asked to speak to you. I told her I would take the call in the morning. But at 11 that night, standing over Oliver's crib in the nursery where I had torn out every hidden camera with my own hands, my phone buzzed. Not Garrett, not Vernon, an unknown number, and a single line of text. Your son offered us something besides money. Ask him what it was before our 5 days are up. 3 days after the baptism, I sat across from Celeste in the office where I had built my first fortune and signed papers that made sure my grandson would never need to trust anyone the way I had trusted my son. The midnight text still burned in my memory. Someone besides money, but that answer would have to wait. First, I needed to make certain the trust was beyond anyone's reach, including my own. Celeste had the restructured documents spread across the mahogany desk in her precise rows. The funds would be locked under Oliver's name, inaccessible until his 25th birthday, with Celeste as sole trustee. No exceptions, no overrides, no emergency provisions that a clever attorney could exploit on behalf of a desperate father. No one can touch it, I said, signing the last page. Not Garrett, not Tamara, not you, and not me. Oliver decides when he's 25. That's the only signature that matters now. Celeste removed her reading glasses and studied me. You're locking yourself out of your own trust. Eugene, you understand that. That's the point. The best vault is one where even the builder can't cheat the combination. She nodded and began feeding the fraudulent transfer documents, the ones Garrett had prepared, with the sticky note and the baptism deadline, into the shredder beside her desk. But before she shredded the last page, she paused. "There's something you should know," she said. 3 months before you came to me, Garrett attempted an earlier transfer. Different routing, smaller amount of test, I think. I flagged it and blocked it without notifying either of you. She met my eyes. I wasn't sure yet, but I couldn't let it go through. 3 months. Celeste had been standing between my son and my money before I even knew the walls were being breached. How do you put a price on making sure the people you love cannot be bought by the people who would use them? You do not. You simply say thank you and hope the word still carries weight. Why didn't you tell me then? I asked. Because I needed to be certain it wasn't authorized. And because I hoped I was wrong about Son. I shredded the last page myself. The sound was satisfying in a way I will not apologize for. That afternoon I drove 40 minutes south to Brattleboro. The pawn shop sat between a laundromat and a closed barber shop, on a street where the parking meters still took quarters. The bell above the door rang when I walked in. And the man behind the counter, 60. Wire-rimmed glasses, a Red Sox cap faded to pink, looked up from a jewelry case. 18-karat case, Swiss movement, engraving on the back, he said before I finished describing it. Lady brought it in September, said it belonged to her employer. It belonged to my father, I said. And his father before him. He set it on the glass counter. $60. She had sold 80 years of Ashford history for $60. And I would have paid $60,000. I placed 3 20s on the counter and picked up the watch without waiting for a receipt. Some transactions do not require paperwork. They require only the feeling of a familiar weight returning to the hand that lost it. The watch smelled like metal polish and old leather and something faintly like pipe tobacco, which was impossible because my father quit smoking in 1971, but which I swore I could detect every time I held it close. The case was scratched near the hinge, new damage. Careless handling, but the crystal was intact and the movement was still running. Steady, measured, patient. I sat in the car outside the shop and opened the case. The engraving inside the cover listed 3 sets of initials. E.R.A., my father, who carried it through Korea and 2 recessions and never once let the winding slip. E.J.A. me, who added my initials on the day I opened the bank. G.L.A. my son, whose letters I traced with my thumb and felt nothing but the absence of the man I had raised him to be. There would be a 4th line. O.J.A. I would have it engraved tomorrow. The ticking filled the car. Some heirlooms carry names. This one carried a heartbeat steady and continuous and older than any mistake one generation could make. I was reaching for the ignition when Vernon called. His voice was careful, the way it always became when the news was worse than the words. Garrett answered the question about what he offered the lenders. Vernon said, "A property deed transfer. Your signature on it." He gave them the estate as collateral. I looked at the pocket watch still ticking in my palm. I never signed any deed. I know, Vernon said. That's the problem, because they don't know that yet. The forensic handwriting analyst took 11 minutes to confirm what I already knew. My son had practiced my signature until it was nearly perfect. The pressure points matched. The loop on the capital A was close enough to fool a bank clerk, but the downstroke on the J leaned 2 degrees left. My hand has never leaned left. That word, nearly, was about to cost Garrett another decade. Vernon laid the analysis on the district attorney's desk alongside the forged deed, and the room shifted, the way rooms do when prosecutors realize a case just doubled in size. The forgery charge was added before lunch. By afternoon, the lender's claim on the estate had collapsed, cease and desist orders went out, backed by the DA's authority. And the men who had idled at my gate 5 days earlier were now subjects of a federal inquiry. The forged deed that had terrified me in the car outside the Brattleboro pawn shop turned out to be the document that cracked everything open. It connected the lending network to Garrett to the conspiracy, and the conspiracy to a paper trail the DA had been trying to build for years. My son's worst crime had become the evidence that produced the most complete dismantling of the threat against my family. The forgery alone adds 5 to 7 years, Vernon said as we stood in the courthouse hallway. Combined with the kidnapping conspiracy and extortion, your son is looking at 15 to 20. He built that number himself, I said. One crime at a time. 15 to 20 years. Oliver would be a grown man before his father walked free. I did not know whether that was justice or tragedy. Perhaps they were the same thing measured from different seats in the same courtroom. Garrett's lawyer negotiated a plea 2 weeks later, an admission of guilt on every count, in exchange for the prosecution dropping the most severe kidnapping enhancement. 12 years. No parole eligibility before 9. Vernon called it the fastest cage he had ever watched close. You want to know what victory looks like when you have won against your own blood? It looks like a courtroom bench that is too hard and a silence that is too loud, and your hands folded in your lap because you do not know whether to clap or cry. It tastes like courthouse coffee, bitter, lukewarm, served in a paper cup that softens before you finish drinking. The afternoon session brought Tamara before the judge. She wore a borrowed blazer navy, slightly too large in the shoulders, and her voice was steady for the first time since the baptism. She had delivered everything Vernon asked for. Financial records tracing the underground debt, witness testimony confirming the staged kidnapping plan, documentation of the coercion that kept her compliant. The recordings from the nursery corroborated every word. The court recognizes the defendant's cooperation and the documented evidence of coercion, the judge said. Probation granted. 3 years. Mandatory counseling. Supervised contact with the minor child. Tamara turned toward the gallery where I sat in the 3rd row. Her eyes were dry. She had spent all her tears in that nursery hallway months ago. I know this doesn't fix anything, she said. But Oliver will know the truth when he's old enough. She had been weak, not evil. In my line of work, I had learned the difference, and it mattered. I nodded once. That was all I had to give her. She accepted it the way someone accepts a glass of water after a long fever, not enough. But proof that the worst part is over. 3 arrests, 2 states, 1 burner phone. The entire chain traced back through the text messages on the device Tamara had surrendered on baptism day. Vernon briefed me on the courthouse steps while November wind pulled at our coats. The burner phone cracked their whole communication chain, he said. Your son's mess turned into the DA's biggest financial crimes case in 6 years. And the deadline they gave me? Dead. The men who delivered it are in federal holding. Your estate, your grandson, your family, they're clear. All of it. I shook Vernon's hand. His grip was firm and brief and professional, and it was the handshake of a man who understood that some victories do not call for celebration. They call for silence and a long drive home. As I crossed the parking lot, a side door opened and 2 marshals escorted Garrett toward a transport van. He was shackled at the wrists and ankles, wearing orange that made his skin look gray. He saw me and stopped walking. The marshals gave him 3 seconds. Take care of my son. Dad, he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of every performance I had heard him deliver in the past year. He's the only thing I did that was real. The marshals guided him into the van. The door closed. I sat in the car for 20 minutes after Vernon left. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had not called in over a year. My daughter Ivy in Portland. She answered on the first ring. Dad, she said. I saw the news. I'm already packed. I'm coming home. Home. That word had been broken for so long, I had forgotten it could still mean something. The plea had moved faster than any case Vernon had seen in decades. Knowing the recordings left nothing to contest. Pushed for early sentencing to limit the damage. Thanksgiving morning smelled like Lorraine's cinnamon bread recipe, the one written in her handwriting on the index card still pinned to the kitchen cabinet, and for the first time in 3 years, someone was actually baking it. Y had arrived from Portland 5 days after the courthouse, rented a cottage 10 minutes down the road, and started showing up at the estate every morning like she was making up for lost time. She was. We both were. She stood at the counter with flour on her sleeves and Oliver balanced on her hip, stirring batter with the same wrist motion her mother used to use. And I sat at the table watching 3 generations breathe in a kitchen that no longer held secrets. Mom would have had the turkey in by 5 a.m., Ivy said, laughing the way Lorraine used to laugh, sudden, full, slightly too loud for the room. I'm already behind. You're right on time, I said. It was the first honest sentence I had spoken in that kitchen in over a year. Ivy set Oliver in the high chair and poured me coffee without asking how I took it. She already knew. Then she sat down across from me and said something I was not prepared for. I knew something was wrong. Dad, before the baptism, I found discrepancies in the family accounts during my visit last Christmas. Small transfers, routing numbers that didn't match any vendor I recognized. I didn't say anything because I thought you were too fragile to handle it. She looked at her hands. I was wrong about that. Yes, I said, you were. We sat with that for a moment. Oliver banged a wooden spoon on the high chair tray, and the sound filled the space between what my daughter had withheld and what I had chosen not to hold against her. Lorraine's photo on the mantel caught the morning light. I swear she was smiling at the flower on Ivy's nose. After breakfast, I carried the pocket watch to my study. The engraver in Brattleboro had done clean work, OJ8, centered beneath the 3 sets of initials already etched inside the cover. 4 generations in an 18-karat case. My father carried it through Korea. I carried it through boardrooms and a marriage and a betrayal that would have broken a less patient man. Oliver would carry it into whatever world waited for him. And he would do it without owing anyone a thing. I placed the watch inside a walnut box I had commissioned the week before. The brass plate on the lid read, Oliver James Ashford, to be opened on your 25th birthday. I set it in the safe beside the restructured trust documents. Dialed the new combination Oliver's birthday and closed the door. The ticking disappeared behind 3 inches of steel. But I could still feel it, the way you feel a heartbeat through a wall. I locked the safe and stood there with my hand on the cold metal for a long time, because the last thing I sealed in that box was the hope that my son might still have been the man I raised him to be. He was not. But his son might be. That was enough to keep winding the watch. You are still here. You listened to a 70-year-old man talk about the worst year of his life, and you stayed. That tells me something about you. It tells me you might need to hear what I am about to say. If someone in your family is using the word love like a skeleton key to your bank account, your dignity, your peace, you are allowed to change the locks. You are allowed to be patient without being passive. You are allowed to watch and wait and build your case with the same precision they used to build their lies. And when the time comes, you are allowed to act without apology. My son is serving 12 years. My daughter-in-law is in counseling. My grandson is asleep in the next room with a trust fund he cannot touch for 25 years and a pocket watch he does not yet know exists. My daughter is baking her mother's bread in a kitchen that almost became evidence in a crime scene. That is not a happy ending. That is a real one. I looked out at the garden where the baptism chairs were still stacked against the shed. Same November light. Same bare maple trees. Same baby sleeping somewhere in this house. But the man sitting in Lorraine's chair was not the same man who watched his grandson get christened 2 weeks ago. That man had been afraid. This one had a safe full of proof that patience, properly aimed, is the most dangerous weapon a family man can carry. Nobody will ever mistake my patience for permission again. And if you have made it to the end of this story, do not let them mistake yours either. And to you listening to my story, remember this: patience is not weakness, and silence is not surrender. I spent 70 years building a life I was proud of, and I nearly lost all of it because I trusted the wrong person with the most dangerous thing a father can offer: unconditional access. I should have seen the signs earlier. I should have asked harder questions when my son moved back home, with debts he could not explain, and a nanny who would not let me hold my own grandson. Do not make my mistake. Do not wait until someone forges your name on a document to realize they stopped seeing you as family and started seeing you as a resource. This was never supposed to be a revenge story. I did not set out to destroy my son. I set out to protect my grandson and preserve what my wife and I spent a lifetime building. But sometimes protecting what you love means standing against the people you love most. That is the hardest lesson I have ever learned, and I believe God put me through it so I could share it with you today. If my story, this revenge story of a father who refused to be a victim, saves even one person from being exploited by someone they trusted, then every sleepless night was worth it. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my position? Would you have turned your son in? Or would you have handled it differently? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. If you have not already, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals is purely coincidental. What matters most